with the house. Am I satisfied with the progress after 38 days? I'm a journey person. I'm always satisfied with my progress. So I don't look... The only way you can estimate your progress from that type of... In my opinion, the only way you can answer that question is if you have a goal in mind way down the end. I don't have a goal down way at the end. So I'm always satisfied with my progress, for the most part. If I had a job which had a deadline, or like I'm pushing a deadline, then not so. However, I want to answer your question a little bit better, as in from a perspective that you're probably asking. So 38 days, where am I, right? So in order to use some, I guess, hyper objectivity to give someone, because my response is kind of unrelatable, right? It's not emotionally relatable. For me personally, I'm generally 90% of the time, I'm gonna say 90% of the time, satisfied, regardless of where I am. However, let's take my progress. So 38 days, let's use hyper objectivity. What is the average person competency at 38 days? I think the median was, let's just say vocab. Like, since Duolingo's strength is vocab, personally, with Duolingo, there's about 480 words. And at my personal reservoir, I'm over 600 plus now, right? I'll end up reviewing this at day 60. Generally, I review things at day 30 and day 60, or I finish section 2 before day 60. That's when I'll review this stuff, but I've been keeping track. So just so that people are curious. So when we take the average, what is the average in 38 days? I think statistically, or like perseverally, I don't really data mine these things. To get to this point, at least in word count, the average is 2 to 3 months. So if we were going to compare it to average, right, or like 2 or 3 statistical average places wherever you get online, I am above average. So in that way, if someone was measuring themselves against a statistical average, then one would say that's a plus for satisfying. In terms of concepts, grammars, I did take a look at a lot of people talk about the JP, LT, and whatnot. And what is my grammar competence? Well, I did cover almost all of N5 myself. So not just Duolingo, but the points, I cover most of N5. And it still lines up to about 2 to 3 months. And 2 to 3 months dedicated. So 5 to 6 hours a day, which is about what I do in general. So right now I'm above average, if that helps with how I'm doing things. There's a big asterisk here. I'm not just using Duolingo, which that's the whole point. However, I'm also not using other tools that are popularly suggested, like Anki, LingQ. The other stuff that I'm doing is my own skills, my own learning skills. So whatever I choose to capture and actively participate is how I'm getting all the other stuff. So some days I'm just naturally curious about this pattern that shows up on Duo. It's not Duo that's teaching me, but it's Duo that's exposing me. So anything that I'm exposed to Duo, I have a natural curiosity to add my skills to understand what it is. It's not Anki, it's not another tool. So you could say that YouTube is a tool, or Google Online is a tool. But there are many sites, many things. So if you want to know where I am at 38 days, I am about a month above average. And if you're asking me personally about my life experience, how does that rank in my progress? I have generally been, when it comes to learning things, like the learning curve stuff, right? If you're talking about learning curve aspects, This is maybe a humble brag or however you. I focus on learning a lot. So generally over the years, the skills that I acquire, I would say if I'm conservatively, I'm in the 85 percentile when it comes to learning curves. So I still believe that I am in the learning curve of Japanese, like finding all the foundations so that I can use Japanese to learn Japanese. That's, if I had a goal, the goal is to be able to learn enough Japanese to use only Japanese to learn more Japanese. That's when my learning period kind of plateaus, and then I'm in the practice period that shows steady acquisition. And during this period, I would say I'm in the 85th percentile. This is a little bit redundant, my bad. That means that if you take all the people in the world, in my opinion, this is not like hard science or anything, I would say I could learn faster than 30 above average, more than 85% of people, in my opinion. I don't know how accurate that is. I have often been characterized as an advanced learner. With that said, I'm not a mastery person, so I don't have a goal down in the line to like pass N2 or become fluent in Japanese. I usually move on. The learning process is what I'm interested in. So yeah, I'm pretty satisfied with some objective metrics. I am ahead of the game. With that said, if you're thinking about like someone who's focused on efficiency, so you also have a perspective. These are the two most common perspectives. The other one's efficiency. How fast am I learning? Right? Lots of individuals, when they think about learning, there's another metric: speed, personal speed. And when I say I'm above 85%, using Duolingo, I'm below average. My personal average. So the way I'm learning now with Duolingo is slower than I usually am. I can think of many methods that I do normally, as in like have been doing, that would most definitely in 38 days, in how much time I put in, 5 to 6 hours a day, I would be way ahead of this. I would say I would probably strive for N3 by 38 days. With that said, that means I learn nothing. That's saying that I'm assuming I choose to learn nothing about how I learn. So what is slowing me down, you might be asking, why am I below average, is largely because I'm using techniques I don't use anymore. Like I don't use these techniques very much. So what makes it super exciting, so then the third aspect, the progress of progress, is fun. That's the third perspective that usually people throw in when it comes to how satisfied they are with learning progress. Fun. And fun is way up. Fun is way above average. The reason why it's way above average is I haven't ever learned anything like this, in this manner, ever. Like being stopped with unsolicited advice, being stopped by people who don't care for me, or being stopped by people who are my opponents, having discussions, having arguments, recording myself, being responsible, obligating myself to be really well rehearsed, having a mindset. Wow, I haven't ever done it this way. I haven't ever acquired some sort of skill in formal education techniques that I don't use anymore in this manner. So it is absolutely fun. So overall, most things are telling me, even objectively, subjectively, I'm very satisfied. The top of the top, though, is that I love the journey. I'm always satisfied. 90%, I want to keep it above 90%. If it dips to 80%, then I start doing rehabilitation. I try to make sure that what is dragging me down. But generally, when I go to decide to do something, the goal is to make it satisfactory. So the long story short is I'm interested in all these different perspectives, but generally I don't choose to do things dissatisfy myself. And that's not a young person's perspective. It's an old person's perspective. And I'm not that old, but I'm getting a half start. I'm getting a not a half start, a head start. I'm getting a head start in a quality of life where when I choose to do something, I don't choose to make myself suffer. And that is the ultimate goal. Every day must be as satisfactory as possible. Hopefully that helps. I gave some statistics and stuff and fun and whatnot because that is very important to people. So is Duolingo itself all these things to other people? I would say it's a mixed bag, and I'll talk about it at day 60. It's a lot to unpack, and I do have a lot of alternatives and psychological tricks, I suppose. Tricks, but suggestions that allow maybe someone who's dissatisfied to find something satisfactory from their use of Duolingo. Yeah. I have a lot to talk about today because yesterday at the end of the day there was another thing, so we're kind of just in that mood now, right? Because now we're going to transit, and this is a great time for me to stop recalling words because I don't think there's anything in transit that I've forgotten. Now, there's nothing in transit. So the real specific transit thing is these things. And now we're going to recall the vocabulary and the kanji of transit section. And I'll go into my digression for today. I've prepared something that will take about an hour to 2 hours of my practice in Duolingo to address. And it's a very important topic because it allows me to learn something about Japanese and the Japanese culture, or demonstrate something about the Japanese culture, in my opinion, from my foreigner lens. So for transit, we actually learn all 4 kanji in this section is related to transit. So let's see if we remember the kanji. This is ikimasu, right? The kanji in ikimasu. It's introduced as ikimasu. However, it is the root word iku, right? Iku, the plain form. That's fine for those who are very snobby about that. And then we have no, that's not in proportion, but that's fine. And then we have kimasu. It's introduced as kimasu. The root is kuru, right? So we have go and come. And this is going to be the source of my 2-hour digression about this is involved in the story yesterday, and I have to unpack it. However, let's add the other 2. We have, which is related to transit. And let's give it a go, because yesterday was the first time we wrote the 4 kanji out. And pretty standard. Now, kanji is pretty standard acquisition. This one... Okay, I'll write the one that I remember for the time being. Right. This is kan in a jikan. And then we have jipun, the hun or the pun. And I'm currently drawing a blank on it. Me. Oh, I remember. Hmm. That's pretty shaky. Hold up. Yeah. So these are the 4 kanji. We have iku, kuru, hun or hun, because we haven't had enough Duolingo practice to see any new patterns. So the pun and hun, we have gohun, gohun, and jupun, jupun. And then we have kan, which only occurred a couple times. So we don't know if that changes or anything like that. All right. So now let's go into our story, because I want to make a video out of this. So it all starts with ikimasu and kimasu. And it spirals pretty hard. So let's start with my digression. Hey, Jamie. Oh, whoa. So from time to time, I have deep digressions, and this time it's very deliberate. These are called deep digressions. So let's put up some disclaimers. Thanks. So let's put up some disclaimers. This is my spiel. This is why I stream, and why a large motivations are taking deep dives into anecdotal psychological things on things. It's to increase appreciation for things, not to interrogate someone or determine who's right or wrong. The idea is to provide enough discussion topics or rhetoric for other people to consider, because I don't like the idea that there are hustles everywhere and individuals don't take things for fact these days and rarely participate in the intellectual stimulation of thinking and challenging themselves. Like, it's not that fun anymore, or that's not entertaining. So these are my attempts to make it a little bit more interesting. At least for myself, this is the way I live. So this is like an activity I do nonstop all the time in my head. The only time when I'm not doing it is when I'm sleeping. Sometimes I have dreams about it, so maybe that's not the best example. So these are called deep digressions, and it starts with the concept of go and come. So yesterday we had a discussion. These were introduced 2 days ago, possibly yesterday, probably only yesterday. And that's the idea of going to something or coming to a location, okay? And so far, the way Duolingo introduced this stuff, it's no biggie. Like, so one of the concerns, this is a deep digression on, we're unpacking unsolicited advice. And yes, as a streamer, I expect this to occur. So in no way, some disclaimers. This is non-emotional, but also me being serious about this stuff. I'm generally very serious about this stuff. So it's unsolicited advice, and I absolutely love it. I might hurt people's pride and stuff, so I'm trying to give everything a fair shake. I really take this stuff seriously. It's the thing that makes me so excited about learning things. So, just as a heads up, right? I'm serious, but non-emotional. In regards to language, well, I have to explain this. So, You'll find out, Jamie, in a bit. So, Duolingo introduced go and come. And I do have I have a regular encounter with someone who who is very passionate, but to be very honest, passionate, but lacking emotional intelligence. And I talked about this quite a bit. There is a duality between having time to work on emotional intelligence versus a passion for skills. All right. So the solicited, unsolicited advice is the idea that when you understand through Duolingo does not explain this, so it is involved in Duolingo. Duolingo does not explicitly, the word explicit is very important, explicitly tell grammar points, as in abstractions. Anything with abstractions, that's not the type of method that Duolingo deploys. You form the abstractions. So this unsolicited advice is an abstraction, as in the advice was, be careful. I'm going to paraphrase the 2 hours more or less. Be careful that these two verbs have perspective differences, as in, and they specifically warn me because I am an English speaker versus a Japanese speaker. Now, the advice is that there's a perspective shift often, right? So, in the evening, I told a lot of times the warning is that if you get them mixed up, it becomes unintelligible. This is the warning. So this is fear-mongering. Sorry, I misspelled unintelligible. But this is fear-mongering. It's one of those that deter mistakes, but out of the kindness of your heart, or this passionate person, they're trying to avert a mistake being made, right? And they specifically use the word unintelligible or intelligible, and then imply that if this mistake is made with go and come, it becomes unintelligible to Japanese. Not only that, there was insistence that Japanese people would find it embarrassing of you as a foreigner. I must articulate this because this is where the component of emotional intelligence comes in. Japanese would be embarrassed. You would embarrass yourself as a foreigner. A lot of this is from this compassion. This compassion to prevent me, which is a kindness, act of kindness, to prevent me from embarrassing myself because perhaps Duolingo lacks this, or I will develop a bad habit, or a mistake will naturally be made, right? Oftentimes people talk about natural mistakes. In fact, this specific phrasing has been thrown around, natural mistakes. To me, as a person who excels, in my opinion, and focuses on learning, when you say natural mistake, for all due respect, this is learning. If it was unnatural mistake, if someone said it's an unnatural mistake, as in misinformation, as in someone is giving misinformation, that's not learning. That's different, right? That's someone deceptively gaslighting you into thinking something else. And it can be unintentional from unsolicited advice. However, when you make natural mistakes, if people naturally confuse this as an English speaker, going through and seeing if you actually naturally confuse this is part of the learning process, in my opinion. However, this person is often very passionate about language that they offer advice to circumvent all these things. And I appreciate that. So let's unpack that. So, how do these things become unintelligible? Well, it all started when I learned go and come, like ikimasu and kimasu in that form, because Duolingo introduces that form. I understand you can do Italian on Duolingo. Thanks, Rubino. I have no plans on using Duolingo, but thank you. Let's see. So go and come, the act. This person insists that English speakers, will need to shift perspectives. And sure enough, I need to confirm for myself, right? So I don't understand Japanese enough in the context of English learners, as in people who use English as learners. So I dug deep because my hypotheses, let's just throw that in first. I personally, at the time of this suggestion, didn't shift perspective. I didn't see it, as in, I don't think I need to. So my hypothesis is I don't have a problem with distinguishing go and come in the Japanese sense. That is my hypothesis. So instead of finding confirmation for my suspicions, I need to understand that I need to challenge it because someone else has a different perspective. So last evening after the stream went off, I started digging. I'm like, what is the perspective shift this person's talking about? Because I had a problem understanding. Why this person thinks my perspective on go and come is not concordant with Japanese or understanding Japanese. So it's this idea, like a deep dive into is the idea that the perspective often can be from the speaker, I guess, or like basically it's that in Japanese it's always from the perspective of the speaker, right? So somehow again, I'm having trouble understanding this, but in English, when you say to go somewhere and to come somewhere, like for something to come somewhere, it's a different perspective, it's like a coming from a different point of view, right? And I can see that sort of. However, I don't quite understand it. Apparently this is a problem and I'm still having trouble processing it. However, there are diagrams, like the illustration would be someone comes to someone else, right? Like the idea is this is the mix that people use, and it's the example the person chose and another person I know, that more than one person. So I'm the odd man out. I'm the person that's being explained to. So where you have subject A can come to B. So whatever A is can come to B, right? That's not what imasu is. This is not imasu. This is ikimasu, as in to go. A goes to B. Fair enough. I had no problems understanding that. What I had a problem with was I don't understand how this is relevant to me. Okay? So here's the thing. This is the classic example that I saw everywhere. So it's confirmed. English people have this problem because I hear other people say this. Like, hey, come to me or come to my house, right? It's go to my house because it's from the perspective of the speaker. The speaker, like the thing, goes to the house, not comes to the house. I get it. I hear other people. But when I started speaking, I got challenged indirectly by saying, I'm saying I don't understand. For me, there's an idiosyncrasy about my English. I don't like using words like go and come. They're not descriptive enough. They don't show direction. They don't show intent. They don't show manner of movement, much like Japanese, oftentimes I prefer to use more detailed words. And that led to a whole discussion about the discretion of using precision when you're asking questions and not. But what, for all intents and purposes, it was really weird for me to say, when I read kimasu, like using kimasu is the train will come in 10 minutes. I do not hear that. That is ludicrously awkward for me. I don't say the train will come in 10 minutes. I say the train will arrive in 10 minutes. The train will depart in 10 minutes. So when someone was talking, it was very innocent conversation. The person was asking, oh yeah, that's kind of weird. I haven't known someone who don't use the word go or come. So they continue to give me examples like, are you coming to the party, right? And the idea is English speakers would use, likely because of Duolingo introducing it as come, to come, they will use kimasu, but it's ikimasu because they're going to it, right? They are going to it as opposed to coming to a location. So I understand that. However, I don't see it as that. If I ask someone, are you coming to the party? I'm asking, are you arriving to the party? Like soon, or you need like more detailed things, right? You modify it with time and direction. So when I see the train is coming in 10 minutes, the 10 minutes is modifying the arrival of the train in the destination. So this is how I view kimasu and ikimasu. And sure enough, in my daily reading, this rule sticks to all the conjugations of kimasu and ikimasu. So not only do I not have a perspective shift issue, I got drowned out by people who think that unsolicited advice was relevant to my problem or my perceived problem. So here's my take on it. And yes, I did find converging evidence of using this technique. Okay, so we have ikimasu. You are departing away from the destination. And the destination is not a literal thing, it's a figurative thing, right? And then kimasu is arriving at a destination. As in, it's closing in on a destination. It's getting closer to a destination. And haven't been introduced in Duolingo, but you know, I took a spicy trip down all the conjugations, all the different forms and conjugations and uses sprinkled around on the use of ikimasu and kimasu, and all of them, almost all of them, gets me the correct conjugation of ikimasu and kimasu using this knowledge right here. And this is me as an English speaker. I see these words meaning this as an English speaker. So not only did this person persistently insist on giving me an advice that is not relevant to me, I was so confused as to what did I do to warrant that advice. Like, in what way, how can I make sense of this advice? So my conclusion here for this part is only the first half. The other half is far more confusing and more mixed. So this person, I understand the perspective shift. So I understand that, yes, it is confusing to English speakers. So thank you for the advice, right? Typical English speakers, maybe. I don't know enough about statistics, but maybe this is a common thing in English. All the sources that I've read indicate that this is a common occurrence, like a common occurrence of using the word come in the ikimasu perspective and not the kimasu section. I get it. So I like to thank this person for being emotionally I guess available to offer me a advice that I need to keep note of and remind other people, so I can pass on this advice to other people. However, by coincidence, this person has failed to understand, along with someone else who I've spoken to quite at length, failed to understand that I do not have this perspective issue. In fact, I said yesterday, I used these exact words. I think, by coincidence, not coincidence, but I think serendipitously, I think like what Japanese people think about these words. I am actually using them in the point of reference that the Japanese people are. It's a coincidence. It's not to say that I won't have other English issues or confusion, but this is not one of them. It actually, I think the word I said is, it felt natural. Like, I like the Japanese people's use for kimasu and ikimasu. In fact, one of the elegance of Japanese is that it's very specific. It's unusually precise. And time again, this person that provides unsolicited advice is assuming that I'm an English speaker, so I don't care about nuance and precision. That has to be the inference here. Offering advice that constantly suggests that I do not pay a close attention to pattern recognition in Duo, and then figuring out what those patterns mean at my own time, is the constant source of unsolicited advice. This goes into our next one. This is our segment into the next unsolicited advice that came out of nowhere. Well, it didn't come out of nowhere. Here, I'll tell you. So a little down the line after this, we talk the statement about I personally find this person, I'm very grateful over the couple weeks this person was able to share their Japanese journey and understanding with me. So in all fairness, I will not use their name too much, but they shared with me that they like, I'm gonna paraphrase, I think they're inferring that they like that the Japanese language, right, the Japanese language never, or tries to not assume third person feelings. I know this is not exactly what the person said. I'm trying to be very specific here because at the time we were referring to how the Japanese language averts or tries not to use their language to infer someone's feelings in the third person, right? And it was more spoken as a take on Japanese culture, in my opinion. That's how I interpret it. So I'm sorry if it was a misunderstanding to that person. We'll talk about this more with that person at some point. Take on Japanese culture. So for my take is the impression that we get from the Japanese language is that you do not assume or try to assume the third feeling. And that comes from a very specific phrase that showed up. And this particular person who offered this aggressive, unsolicited advice is again trying to protect me from misuse or misunderstanding, and that would cause me embarrassment in front of Japanese people, right? Which, for the record, I'm no stranger to embarrassment. I'm in the United States. I'm multicultural, so I actually embrace embarrassment. Embarrassment is how I learn. So I'm not engraved into a Asian face culture. And the face culture, the concept of face culture, is going to play a big role in what I was trying to say yesterday, but didn't ever get to because of the aggressive nature of this unsolicited advice, right? So the advice is, you cannot say Ken-san, for example, Ken-san wa ramen ga hoshii desu. Right? This would assume that Ken desires ramen. All right? I don't know where this came from. And right, I don't actually know where this exact example came from because I'm not even sure if I remember it. But there's a stickler for this, okay? So here you have the idea that they're trying to prove their point. So this is confirmation bias. So we're already working in the area of confirmation bias. So I'm already confused if this actually occurred in Duolingo because they use Ken-san, right? And Ken-san is a name that is used in Duolingo, but I didn't actually see the sentence anywhere. All right, so that's had yet to be confirmed. So it's actually it's a jab on Duolingo, even though I have no idea where this is coming from. And this person, without a doubt, maybe they're not emotionally intelligent enough to be aware of their own prejudices, but all the time, all the unsolicited advice is targeted at something that either Duolingo doesn't do, or they are prejudiced against how it misrepresents, arguably misrepresents. And what I say by that is the previous discussion we had with this person is regarding the particle wa, how wa is being presented. And after, wa'ing all over the place for over 30 days, it's unfounded. I absolutely disagree that there was any indication that wa was being misrepresented because there was a lack of information. So what this person was inferring is that English people will naturally misunderstand or misinterpret the wa pattern or the wa use because Duolingo didn't explain it. So here's the thing. Duolingo didn't explain it, so there's no misinformation. It's more of a lack of information. So that unsolicited advice was probably to be preventive, right? Preventive by providing more advice that Duolingo doesn't have. That's fair, but that's not how that information was presented. It was presented aggressively as saying Duolingo is making people bad learners, as in Duolingo is leading people to think that wa is something it's not. Well, yes and no. I can see how the pattern would play into English's tendency. However, for that, which was a deep cut way back in the first 3 weeks, I didn't have that. I saw the pattern and I only use wa in that pattern until I understand what that pattern is. So if you were evaluating Duolingo based on the pattern it used, wa was specifically used correctly, grammatically correctly in all of its instance. It's the user that is inferring the error. And not only that, this unsolicited advice was presented as a prejudice thing, where that person presented like, oh yeah, wa, even grammar books, crappy Japanese grammar books, lots of it has conditioned a lot of people to miswrite what wa is. And for me, I had a counterpoint. When I went to dig for evidence of people saying that wa is a subject marker, that was the argument, which we'll try to cut short, but a subject marker, right? This person had an agenda. It was very visible. I don't know if they're emotionally intelligent to be aware, but they had a prejudice that they were very frustrated that people are saying subject marker. Wa is a subject marker. And I agree. Wa is not only a subject marker, but I disagree that it's incorrect. It is correct. It can be a subject marker, but it's more than that. I looked probably up to like 3 days now, maybe 15 hours in the evening. Wa is being written as a topic marker, not a subject marker. And this is more of an English conundrum. A topic marker in this case is used to be applicable to a subject marker. So it's a subject marker, but it's really a topic marker. So in no way did I found 100 years or 50 years of grammar misrepresentation where they're saying wa is a subject marker. It's actually wa is a topic marker, which is inclusive of a subject marker. Why is this relevant? Well, we still have wa here, so they probably threw in wa for that reason. And another, which links back, is the same aggression against Duolingo. So Duolingo does not explain the use of hoshi desu, right? Ga hoshi desu, right? So what this person is trying to warn me is that this is being introduced as the predicate for want. So we're seeing a pattern here. The last time it was go and come. This time is want. And it comes from perspective. Again, the Japanese cultural perspective. So you cannot, it's very impolite, right? It's very impolite to assume someone's meaning. That was the idea of the comment. And it's also, according to this person, grammatically very, very literal, grammatically incorrect. So my goal is, I don't see a grammatical error here, like a non-feeling, non-culturally relevant grammatical error. So I spent the evening trying to figure out if it is indeed grammatically incorrect as best as I can. And I'm not going to say that I have a definitive answer, but for now, my response is maybe it's grammatically incorrect. Okay, maybe. The idea is that there's a topic that's marked, and hoshi desu having a object marker, ga onto ramen. So when you say, if you ignore this topic, right, you still have the grammatically structural, accurately correct ramen ga hoshi desu, which means I desire ramen. And in this case, this is politely, or this is behaviorally acceptable. As in expressing your own desires is behaviorally acceptable. So right now, my inclination to believe is that you don't use this because you try never to use it, because so it might as well be accepted as grammatically incorrect. I think that's where the impression was getting. It might as well be grammatically incorrect because you do not use this. It's very impolite. It's discouraged, right? It feeds into the notion that in the Japanese language, and maybe by extension, the Japanese culture never assumes or tries to assume third person feeling. And that's as good as I can get with being fair to this person, right? Now, here's the deeper cut. And this is relevant to my use of the Duolingo. I thought to myself, okay, where have I seen this phrase before? Have I seen Duolingo literally suggests this setup as acceptable? As in, is there any place in Duolingo that demonstrate a pattern that tells me you can do this? Okay? Because there's a difference between inferring and assuming stuff when you see a pattern versus literally knowing what the pattern is. And I'm trying to think back as far as I can. So what did I do? I spent like 30 minutes watching all my video, like a bunch of my videos where I think Hoshides comes up, and on like 2x speed, and try to find out if there was a prompt in which they used and assumed the third person desires something. And I have yet to find one. So not only did this person, it's still, the jury's out, because maybe I'm gonna be hyper aware of this now. So when it comes up again, it'll be a learning lesson. I'll be able to tell people, hey, you shouldn't use Oshides to imply or infer someone else's desire. You can use it acceptably and I guess grammatically correctly to express your own desires. That's acceptable, right? So that's probably where I'm at right now for this. I don't think Duolingo actually has ever done this. Not that they don't so they still don't explain why that's the case. But as a person who used Duolingo, like myself, who's looking for patterns, there is no pattern that insists that I could even do this in the first place. I haven't ever seen it in raw format that Ken-san, Naomi-san, Hana-san desired anything. It has always been in the form of an object and a self-expression. Like, I don't know, in the house it would be takai hondana ga hoshii desu, as in I want a expensive bookshelf. Has the whole session yesterday, nothing was in third person. There was no third person. It was just you. You used to live in a old house, or like that's a live, sorry. You want a new apartment, you want a spacious apartment. Like me, I want a spacious apartment. I want a new air conditioner. I want something. It has always been I want. So when I read this again yesterday and I sat down and I thought, I don't remember ever writing this. Like, I don't think I've ever translated a word in Duolingo that said, Ken-san wants ramen. It felt so weird. And guess what? Because I'm willing to bet this format doesn't even exist in Duolingo. So not only did this person insist that this is wrong, and it's to prevent people from using this wrong, I get it. It's kind of like the whole go, and come situation. You're assuming that I'm a person that in English I wouldn't ask if I could do this and just use it without knowing. So once again, it's to be protective of common errors that English people make. Yet this person did not ask me if I had a problem with it. However, they were also motivated to, in my opinion, slander Duolingo once again, because Duolingo doesn't explain anything, and this guy likes to explain some things. Sure, I like it, so now I can inform people if this ever happens, like, oh yeah, you shouldn't use this. I don't think it's grammatically incorrect. It's grammatically correct, but it might as well be grammatically incorrect because you don't use the phrase like this. Okay, so there's a difference between grammatically correct and emotional intelligence, in a way, ironically, for this person, because this person, in my opinion, lacks emotional intelligence. They throw emotional intelligence out the room all the time for providing unsolicited advice. Yesterday's confusion was that I did not understand why the advice is relevant here, because I'm in agreement. Like, all the things that person said was like, yes, that's exactly what I think it is. Thanks. I know. Am I doing something wrong? But it's really because this person wanted to emphasize that English speakers make these errors. Great. And I happen to be an English speaker who's also saying that I don't have these problems, and I agree with you. the whole time, and I was baffled. I still don't understand why this person continued to press a point that I agree with them. And then now I'm going to talk about the point I wanted to make, because it's a really, really good one. It's the one that I find that I tackle a lot as, I guess, a multicultural person and also an Asian person who's hyper focused on Japanese culturalism, along with in the guise of like Chinese culturalism as a foreigner, right? Because I don't live in Japan, I don't live in China, but from a lens of the foreigner who happens to also be Asian. And this goes back to the idea that Japanese people don't assume third person feelings. And this is my deep cut for my digression, because this is where I was going while this person constantly talked about language and anthropology and stuff. I was talking about psychology and philosophy largely. So this person counter-argued with anthropological facts, and I'm not disagreeing with them. Those are actually anthropological facts. And then they kept telling me about the limitations of anthropology because of the Japanese language. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm not talking about the Japanese language anymore. What this was inferring is, in the context of the Japanese language. Also, I do have to throw in an extra. That person also said you can use the garu to infer to suggest someone's third feelings. And yes, that checks out. Again, it's another fact that Duolingo hasn't introduced it yet even, but you can use garu to some extent. From my research, you can use it to strongly infer that someone appears to want something or appears to feel a certain way. Fair enough. That's how that person said to grammatically correctly express the thing, which was irrelevant to my topic right now, but let's just keep that on bookshelf. I totally forgot about this. I did like maybe an hour into how garu works, but it's not part of the Duolingo lesson, so maybe another time down the road we'll revisit this. So Japanese people don't assume third person feelings because this is inferred in their behavioralisms through their language. And a lot of times I always talk about learning a language is also learning about the Japanese culture, right? Or like learning a country's language can be very eye-opening and lens through other things. The difference here is, in my opinion, we're inferring that Japanese people don't assume third-person feelings because their language strays away from that. It's very indirect. Sometimes it's very polite, right? Like there's lots of dictations to remove misunderstanding, things like that, right? Yeah, markers. Oh, garu helps me mark that I am expressing something in a certain way. Directionality in language and stuff, and it was contrast to the English language. The basis is that we're English users, and then English culture, by comparative sake, don't assume third person feelings. And then I get that. I back that idea, especially from the language, Japanese language perspective. Absolutely. And that's the elegance of the Japanese language. The intent is built into the language far more than English, in my opinion, debatably. So compared to English, right? Now I stepped away from the Japanese language and I was thinking about psychology. All right. It's like the intersect of psychology and anthropology. Oftentimes there's a lot of overlap between these two. So my take was that I wanted to offer an alternative rhetoric. And by rhetoric, I mean things to think about, but I don't really have answers, right? I'm not thinking about answers. I'm asking questions. So the question is, I can definitely see from the Japanese language that they don't assume third person feelings. what is the psychological consequences of having a writing system that makes you hyper aware of other people's feelings? Like, for example, as an English person, right? As people who are English, who are learning Japanese, when you have to think about the grammatical structure of the writing system and the language, you must constantly be aware of other people's feelings, right? You have politeness markers, you have directional markers, you have whether it's grammatically acceptably correct to say that Ken-san wa ramen ga hoshii desu, right? From a perspective outside of the Japanese system. What does that do psychologically? Well, one, you could presume that, and this is an argument by the unsolicited person, that if it's normalized, like if it's a normalized rule, people don't have to make assumptions anymore. Don't make assumptions, right? So, for example, this is going off the same type of logic that this is going. Logical psychology, I suppose. Where if the Japanese language has already dictated how you can express things and how you can write things, it would also translate leap of logic to the idea that Japanese people don't assume third-person feelings psychologically. All right? So, and if it's normal, if it's so normal, they no longer assume it. They just accept it as facts. I think the particular word that popped up was zeitgeist, which I don't even know if I understood how it was being used, but basically, if something is so normal and so accepted as the norm, the populace would no longer make that assumption anymore. So it's not assuming third-person feelings. So my argument for writing this, it's counter. I guess it's a great way to challenge my notion that having a writing system that constantly needs to take attention to the person's feelings would make people not assume it anymore because it's so common. So the question is, my proposal on this rhetoric is, does it actually do that, or literally do the opposite, or figuratively do the opposite? Now let's entertain that, because in a way, I like to believe this is true. Like, this person is suggesting that it's obvious. The way this person holds themselves is, it's obvious that this is true because of the Japanese language, because they are, in my opinion, consumed in the realm of facts regarding the Japanese language. Not actually, in my opinion, in psychology. I'm stepping back a little bit. So, for me, it's literally the opposite. And not just because I don't understand the Japanese language. I'm also someone who was brought up in a face culture. And if there is any indicator, like if there's any obvious example of a face culture, it would technically be China, but Japan equally for the top spot in terms of media exposure and how face culture works. And to sum up, to be not too superficial, a face culture is a concern for others' feelings. So in a face culture, you make sure you never embarrass yourself in public. You always act polite. You always do the things that are assuming what the other person takes as politeness. That is a face culture. And Japan is one of the biggest face culture that has good media exposure. China is the other one. All right? So is it because they're not assuming the third person feelings, or they're always assuming the person's feelings? What are some real world examples, actually anthropological in nature, but also psychological in nature, examples of these? Well, when you are writing a system where in psychology and philosophy that humans have emotions and they require vehicles of expression, and also methods of empathy. In my recent years, and this is the irony, because I imagine the person that said Japanese people don't assume third person, they're very, I find that we become quite close now as friends. The irony here is they watch a form of medium, or maybe the irony, they watch a form of medium that already demonstrates the opposite encounter of a Japanese language. So a country that has a language that is very precise to the point, but precisely indirect to avoid assumption about people's feelings. The irony here is those people who are interested in the Japanese language consume a medium, anime, and manga. And one of the classical interpersonal conflicts that is in anime and manga is assuming people's feelings. So not only is this where I was going, I didn't ever get into it because we never got there. It was late. I needed to go. The idea is it's not that obvious. No, it's not obvious that Japanese people don't assume. It is pretty obvious if you only think about their language. Like, you stop caring that they're human beings and they're basically robotic people who precisely obey their Japanese language. But in execution, that hyper awareness of their language, the decorum that their language enforces, actually creates a hyper focus on how other people feel. What this is, how does this show up? Think about the nightlife in Japan. Think about the salaryman and what they talk about when they talk about the lack of self-expression. What they're doing is they're constantly assuming the politeness. They're assuming what they have to do. Constantly being reminded of what they're keeping and what they're assuming the other person is feeling. It's a country that doesn't use self-expression a lot of times, and precisely use self-expressions in very specific cases. And this is not, I'm trying not to sound like another internet influencer. However, in my household, personal anecdote that I can share, as a person that is also a product of face culture, like parents from a face culture, when you spend lots and lots of time using your language to promote politeness, decorum in public, that tends to enhance the obvious human condition of psychology and philosophy, in the realm of psychology and philosophy, that you're paying attention to those feelings. In order to execute decorum is to constantly be aware of other people's feelings and constantly be aware of your feelings. But you can't express it because that's the language decorum. Like, now you have a language that does that, right? So when you're executing the language as an English speaker from the outside, if you're talking about, oh yeah, why do we keep talking about politeness and why do we keep talking about third person feelings, or if it's grammatically correct or not, It's because it matters that you're assuming other people's feelings. It's not because you want to ask what the other person's feeling. In fact, it's actually very personal, almost to an egregious extent, to ask how someone is feeling in Japan. Like maybe in the nightlife, when you're off work, throwing back a few highballs, or when you get home and you're talking to your kids and everything stays in the house. As a product of face culture, your emotions stay at home. It does not vindicate what you don't see, which is the oppressive but impressive. So the impressive ability of Asian face culture, which includes Chinese and Japanese, the impressive nature of how they are constantly reminded of their emotions, but still executes proper decorum. So as a human being, if you understand, in my opinion, the human condition, in the realm of psychology and philosophy, being emotional is part of the human experience. So when you start distilling the human condition based on Japanese an anthropological fact that is a writing system, you lose the connection with what it's like to be human. So the idea was, I was proposing an alternative perspective. Like, okay, well, if they don't express or assume things in their language, right? In their language, does it mean they don't assume people's feelings? And my rhetoric is, I might even make an argument or a compelling narrative that the Japanese people actually care and assume more frequently than a country that has a language that encourages you to be descriptive, because the language is fundamentally messy and intolerant. So in English, it is very, very common to not only assume or infer other people's emotions, it also collectively encourages other people to ask how they feel, and also collectively increases self-expression. So you can argue in all or none for Japanese, but in average for English. So on average, you're going to have people who don't express, people who do express, but what happens is the language is noisy. Then it's going to have a specific average. In Japan, you have this divisive perspective where they either don't ever assume, or they try never to assume people's feelings, to they always assume. And for me, that's kind of what it means to think of zeros and ones and averages. Japan is a conformist society. It is one that I love a lot because it aligns with some of my values as a Chinese person, actually, or as an American Chinese person. I don't know how people identify me these days. However, what I can say is that it's the tough ass here is, if you're in a society that has a lot of rules, but they are counter and dissonant with the aspect of the human condition, psychology and philosophy, does that mean they don't do it? Well, besides anime and manga and current events and the household dynamics, of which none of the English speakers probably have, the idea is that these very human people find it exhausting and almost burdensome to an extent, while still holding up their duties as a very polite, non-assuming on the surface. But we've heard this all before, where it's Humans are still conditionally humans. So in fact, I actually would argue that they do it more often than a country that is messy, with a language that is messy in self-expression. Not only is expressing yourself not almost considered grammatically incorrect, it's grammatically messy. Like adding random words and interjections or assuming someone's feelings, back and forth, arguing, that's the English language. The English language differs and it's very messy. A language like this that promotes a behavior like don't assume people's feelings, that doesn't mean it's not happening, in my opinion. It actually might even do the opposite. So there's a leap of logic here, which that leap of logic can explain two different things: how Japanese people act and how Japanese people speak. When they act, it's most definitely not concordant with the idea that they assume other people's feelings. Like that they don't assume other people's feelings. That dramatic, the diversity in bombastic, incredible, loud, emotional outbursts, and then the surprising to like foreigners, the sudden nuances of like, oh, I'm sorry, like, making things that were unexpected and they hyper apologetic and whatnot. That is not because they don't assume the other person's feelings. That's literally because they do assume the other person's feelings. That's an inherent cultural dissonance between a face culture and the United States in general in the United States. So when I make a mistake and a foreigner laughs at a Japanese person laughs at me, I don't see the same face culture embarrassment. I can see it more than a lot of individuals who do not grow up in a face culture household. But face culture is a hyper awareness. It is a hyper awareness of other people's feelings. Not only that, in order to be consistent, you're always assuming the other person's feelings. For example, when I try to approach my parents, if I try to suggest something, I have to assume my parents' feelings that they have seniority. So I have to be careful and polite to not elicit something that would be construed as rude. That is assuming another person's feelings. So not only do face cultures probably assume other people's feelings, I would say a fun, interesting rhetoric that one must consider is that they always assume other people's feelings. That is the rule. The rule is to assume and be polite and then solicit the feelings. But it's built on the concept of assuming someone's feelings. Like, oh, I'm not concerned whether this is considered as rude. I just assume it's rude, so I won't do it. Right? So when my parents come up to me and they try to ask me something, they assume they're inconveniencing me. Like, oh yeah, do you have time? Like, they're being polite. Even in a social family gathering, the assumption is that when you ask someone to help, it's considered rude or like it inconveniences them. Oh, I mean, I don't represent other Americans, but man, if a Japanese person come up to me and ask me for help, I will try my best to help them. I actually enjoy that. That is part of the assumption they're making, that they're inconveniencing me, so they're very apologetic, and it reinforces that apology. But do they really what are they assuming about it? They didn't actually ask me, they inferred it, right, by their stuff. So people do assume feelings. In fact, in face culture, it's almost the rule than the exception. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. Like, it's not that obvious, and I'm not even saying that's what happens. It's not obvious. When you look at the Japanese language, certainly it's very precise, and there's only like a few handful ways of expressing things, and it's very indirect. But man, All those people that I've talked to, I'm sure they've watched anime and manga, right? Throw up a rom-com, throw up a slice of life. What is the fundamental conflict of interest in Japanese culture? And now, ironically, anime and manga, that trending aspect of failing for interpersonal skills, because interpersonal skills rely on assuming other people's feelings because of face culture, right? That resonates in the West now as well, because in my opinion, this is a deep cut for another time, in the Western culture, the internet community, which can be said to be dominated by the Western world, find anime and manga very trendy because they also experience that failure, that difficulty, the difficulty to exercise interpersonal skills. So they get advice on how to assume other people's feelings. Like, you have to do this and that. This is the way you behave to get a girl. This is the way you behave to, and you execute on that, or you worry about it the whole time. So when the interpersonal skills are no longer reinforcing, hey, ask the person, talk to the person, feel free and liberating yourself, but also know that that other person feels the same. And it's not that anymore. It's about the insecurities about doing the right thing and the wrong thing based on assumptions. You no longer see the human being as someone who's willing to compromise and be embarrassed, you see the human being as I need a proper way to express myself, and I have to do it correctly in the way that I need to assume a lot of things about that person's feelings instead of going through the noisiness of compromise and interpersonal skills and communication, which is where I'm hyper focused on. So I am biased. I am absolutely biased. My whole segue is to lead to the idea that emotional intelligence, especially even people who learn Japanese and think that they understand what compels a human to do specific things, is lacking emotional intelligence. And anime and manga, the individuals that consume anime and manga could even say things like Japanese don't assume third-person feelings, when most of their media that they consume that comes from Japan is often the result of assuming third-person feelings. You watch that, anime that went 3 seasons long, and those two people still haven't talked to each other about how they feel because they just assume how they feel, right? Instead of openly talking about it and removing the consternation of, oh, what is the feeling of this? It becomes avoidant. So what is likely? A country that has a language that's completely avoidant of emotional expression, to the point where you have people who learn and say, oh yeah, Japanese people don't assume people's third feelings because you have to consider that in their writing, and it might as well be considered grammatically incorrect, to a country that is littered with an explicit language that requires that everyone assumes, infers, and expresses their feelings. The likely case, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, is when you factor in psychology and philosophy into the anthropological existence of a Japanese language, or even the linguistic approach, the outcome is that the vast majority of people still can't exceed or live beyond the human condition, which is feelings. So I would argue the more you suppress and oppress your feelings, give it a writing system or stuff, the more likely, in order to make that possible, and that's where I was getting at, it is possible in a monocultural setting where everyone assumes the rules about feelings, not because it's so normal that they become unaware of their feelings. Japan no longer exists in a vacuum. it sends ripples. It actually, Japan is a tourist haven. Like, they get a lot, and they are constantly reminded of their face culture, and they will continue to be challenged by the idea that they are reminded that they assume other people's feelings all the time, to the point where it becomes burdensome. It is part of what I admire about the Japanese culture, where they are able to do this, like, not be tempted to go beyond this, like, look at self-expression, inquire about someone's feelings at all. So weird. I don't know. That was the point I was gonna make in the 2 hours I was trying to spend wondering why this person is constantly suggesting that I'm talking about some sort of Japanese language, or the misuse of hoshides. There's, in my opinion, still at the moment, no perspective shifts for the use of kimasu or ikimasu to wrap things up. And I still can't think of an instance in which Duolingo used hoshides when describing a third person's feelings. But that's fair. That is very fair, because one day I might end up using it, since Duolingo didn't suggest it's wrong. Well, for me, it's possibility, but I'm a person who observes something and must confirm what I'm inferring. So since I haven't ever seen hoshides, at least not to my knowledge, not to my recent knowledge, that hoshides had a topic modifier that was the third person ever, it's not enough to be salient in my mind to say, oh, I'm confident this is how you can use it. I might have a chance to glancingly say, oh, can I do this? Because as an English speaker, personally, I would ask first, how do you feel about this sentence, Mr. Japanese person? Can I say, Ken-san wa ramen ga hoshii desu? And they would say, no, that is unintelligible and maybe possibly grammatically incorrect. You would want to use garu, or perhaps in another way, you would ask how they feel. And guess what? 9 out of 10 times, I would probably ask the person how they feel first. Because unlike the narrow-minded, closed perspective, for better or for worse, passionate and maybe very skilled knowledge of someone who's hyper-focused on something, when you step back, it's the full package. When you're constantly ignoring feelings, you are hyper-aware of other people's feelings. It's both. You need both. And then in an English culture, when they're constantly like expressive and they're constantly talking and assuming other emotions, they are also constantly aware of asking and talking about emotions. It's both. It's not whatever your confirmation bias wants you to think. Basically, oh, English people always assume people's feelings more than Japanese people, so therefore I should offer this unsolicited advice because my perspective is so small that it only restricts to the anthropological facts regarding Japanese language. And that's my spiel, right? For better or for worse, I don't know if this is true. These are observations, right? Like, what I mean is, my rhetoric is that these are the thoughts that I have to think about. When I learn a Japanese language and I put it in the perspective of an English speaker, this comes up all the time and it's brilliant. I think this is the part of learning a new language that feels missing in a lot of people, where it's generally about the raw vocabulary and the stuff. I like to think of the implications, right? Implications make it interesting. Like, I won't forget Hoshi desu now, thanks to that person. So I'm not ungrateful at all. I actually find it very fun. Like, I have very fond and endearing feelings about it, because now I get to tell the story of Hoshi desu, and I get to explain some of the things about kimasu and ikimasu, right? And there you have it. That's I actually finished a little bit early. It only took me about an hour. But it's probably because I skipped Garu, what I learned about Garu. But Garu is an alternative method of expressing third-person feeling. Maybe Duo will introduce that, maybe it won't. One thing for sure is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias. And emotional, or maybe a lack of emotion, prejudicial bias. I don't know how to say this part. Typically makes you want to see what you want to see. And you mix that with, if you don't see it, is it true? For example, Duolingo did not provide grammar points for Hoshides or anything really. It's based on pattern recognition and relying on the intuition of the person to either be cognitively curious or not. So it is very, very ripe ground for anyone who has a grammar point. There are places where grammar points are introduced in the guide and the guidebook and stuff, for sure, but it's surface level stuff, absolutely. But the question is, though, are you a pattern person? Are you learning by patterns, or are you learning by your intellectual use, right? Your intellectual skills. And most of the people are intellectual skills because they are secondary learners. Language as a second language. I mean, language as a secondary acquisition, right? So for me, yes, as well. However, I'm trying not to do that because Duolingo uses a strategy that is when you're a kid or younger. And I kind of like that. What does that do? It makes me slower. I already talked about my progress or my satisfaction and whatnot. It leads into this. So yes, it is slower than I usually go, for sure, because I'm not using this. However, ironically, this is also slowing me down even more because everyone else thinks like this. So naturally, I can continue to think with patterns and then have other people fill in the intellectual stimulus. Hence this digression. This digression would be one of them. Regardless or not, when you use Duolingo, you will not enter a conversation about the politeness of a language, its appropriate use, Hoshides, the perspective shift. This is through the discussion with other people who are dissatisfied or maybe even emotionally unintelligent, like unintelligible to themselves about how biased and how much they're attacking a product that probably doesn't even intend to do so. And then using that frustration to project onto another person, which by coincidence, from my perspective, don't even share those misconceptions. I often feel like in this case, because I speak American English, I suddenly stop being Chinese and stop being someone who's interested in the Japanese culture. I don't know what their prior experience is, but that's a leap of logic. And ironically, that's assuming everything. It's assuming so many things when you're providing unsolicited advice. Here's the greatest irony. Someone who's so interested in the Japanese language and also by transitive property, the Japanese culture. One of the golden rules about Japanese culture is not to provide unsolicited behavior. As a human condition, if you're providing unsolicited behavior, you are either assuming and projecting your own emotions, or you are assuming and inferring another person's emotions. So if you naturally understand the Japanese language and perhaps the Japanese culture, this would be one of the top 5 things about unsolicited behavior, especially in the form of advice. It's ironic because the hoshides thing, the one common misuse of hoshides that I found on the internet is advice. Advice ga hoshides. That's asking for unsolicited advice. Like, the irony here is an English speaker would find it normal to ask that other person, hey, do you desire advice? Like, do you want advice? It looks like you need advice. But at least that is more than someone who goes on and assumes that person needs advice and do it anyways. That is the irony. Like, it's so unpredicted, right? So yes, one can be incredibly knowledgeable, and I'm super appreciative of that. Like, I love knowledge. It doesn't necessarily make you emotionally intelligent. It doesn't lead to emotional intelligence. It generally doesn't. It might actually make you less emotionally intelligent because you're no longer sharing the same experience. This person doesn't see me as a person that is learning Japanese, who also is Asian, or possibly grew up in a face culture, or even have predilections that may be in line with the Japanese culture. They were focused on the fact that I didn't know Japanese enough, or more than them. And that's called a lack of emotional intelligence, in my opinion. So, there you have it. It's not the best ending, I would say. However, I still welcome everything. It's something to think about, right? I most definitely do not know more about the Japanese language than pretty much everyone I've encountered. Generally speaking, you have to understand the situation of Twitch, right? Twitch, commentary from Twitch is predicated on the assumption that the advice places you at a higher competency. So when someone is compulsively trying to offer unsolicited advice, they're at a higher position of knowledge. And I'm okay with that. I actually love that. In the Japanese culture, ironically, that is a big no-no. Especially if age comes into it, seniority comes into it, maybe even title comes into it. That's unacceptable. And you have to consider all that. Japanese people constantly consider that. I don't. So not only do I find this incredibly engaging and pretty much non-offensive, it's very telling about the people I'm talking to, or the classical people I'm talking to. Twitch people, when it comes to a learning stream, they come in, offer unsolicited advice because they project higher competence. And by all means, go ahead. I absolutely love it. I take the advice and it becomes part of me. So how much of Duolingo provided my grammar points? Duolingo pretty much provided like maybe 7 grammar points in 37 days. How many grammar points did I get? Like, as a consequence of streaming Duolingo? Probably over 50 grammar points. In fact, I don't think I'm ever going to get to like 30% of the things I've read about grammar due to using Duolingo and not Duolingo itself informing me. The act of doing Duolingo. So in the Japanese sense, the act of doing Duolingo led me to a lot of grammar points, not Duolingo providing me the grammar points. and this is one of them. So there you go. Ikimasu. Ikimasu. And hoshii desu. Right? Those are our current ones. We already learned a lot about the plain form, even the ta form, the nai form, or like the nai, you know, different conjugations, nai, shita, like te form, what have you. There's so many, but they're not here. They're not even introduced yet in Duo. So we have a head start. So that's a wrap. I wanted to make an honest attempt at unpacking that situation because I was incredibly dumbfounded. I was so dumbfounded that I needed an evening to really collect my thoughts. So I'm sure we'll have more and more discussions about the intricacies of the Japanese language and how it's used in the public, since I don't live in Japan and I won't be using that type of thing and having those encounters. With that, I'm going to take a quick bathroom break. I'll be right back.